everybody, and welcome here to the Wine with Jimmy channel. Thank you for clicking by. So, all things wine education here, really designed to help you understand, appreciate, and enjoy wine just a little bit more, because the world of wine is wonderful and there's plenty of things to know. So, here, welcome to a series called Explaining Wine Terminology. So this is very important about key terms that you could hear people talking about in wine. So it could be that you're a consumer and you hear someone like a sommelier talk about it, or maybe you're in the trade and you want to know more about a specific topic. I'm going to talk here about mousiness. So you'll see here a nice little cute mouse, long-tailed one, and we are going to talk about really the problem of mousiness in wine. Maybe you've heard of this, maybe you haven't, but it is a more common feature that we find today with the emergence of natural wines or wines along the low intervention style. If you have a question about this type of taint and you would like to pose that question, or maybe you have a comment, please do pop it in the comment section below this video. It's always nice to hear from you and really about your experiences, because other people that watch this video will like to read those comments about the experiences to give them more information around the world about this potential problem in wine. Please make sure you click like and subscribe as well. Okay, let's talk about this issue. I love that picture as well. I hope that no mice were harmed in the process of that picture. I'm sure they weren't. I think it's been photoshopped. You'll see it's weeing as well. So let's get into that. So what is mousiness? So we have the question posed up here. Let's go through it. I'm going to give you the information with some nice pictures as well. So mousiness, or mouse taint, or mousy taint, as you'll see up there, sometimes called goutte de cerise in French, or Mausel by German speakers, is a bacterial infection in fermented beverages and food, which creates really a very unpleasant aftertaste that the potential drink or food will have, certainly when it is first tasted and then ingested. It's very unpleasant. Now, how long have we known about this? Because maybe it's the first time that you are hearing about it. Well, we first have it being recorded, the first mention, at the end of the 19th century. And there was an observation of a very disagreeable flavour in wine, closely resembling the residence of a rodent, of mice. Now, the compounds, which we'll go through in a couple of slides' time, actually were first identified at the end of the 20th century. So the problem was identified, but actually the chemistry behind it was about 100 years later. So if it was identified at the sort of end, the last sort of 20, 30 years of the 20th century, why have many of us not heard about this? Well, in fact, because of industrialization and the commercialization of wine, with lots of chemicals being used to create very clean and commercially successful wines, certainly after the Second World War, the problems of mousiness were very minor and, in fact, very unexperienced for many people. So really, we've had almost this problem becoming extinct. But with the re-emergence of low intervention and natural wines, certainly a lot of people not adding sulfites, sulfur dioxide to their wines for protection, we are seeing this kind of modern movement of traditional, natural, low intervention wines and the re-emergence of mousiness, because it is prevalent in certain conditions which may align themselves with more natural wine making. So yes, it is back with a vengeance. Mousiness strikes back. So we're starting to see it a little bit more. Please don't send complaints about that picture. It's a Photoshop, I'm pretty sure. So, first of all, can we smell mousiness? The short answer here is no, we cannot. We can't first detect mousiness until we actually will sip the wine and start to ingest the wine. That's because the compounds that cause it, that we'll go through next, are not volatile at the normal pH of wine. And wine sits roughly, at 3 to 4, with some being outside of that spectrum. So it's not volatile at the normal pH of wine. But the wine, of course, then reacts with your saliva. And your saliva has a more alkaline version of acidity, often around 5.7 towards 8 on the pH scale. Now, this heightening, this increase of pH that the wine experiences due to your saliva, then creates the possible volatility for the wine to give off this mousiness through your retronasal passage. That's the tube that connects the back of your mouth to your nose. Now, we don't taste it immediately, yes, because we need that reaction to happen in your palate and then go through the back of your palate through your retronasal. You'll often find it's about 10-15 seconds after the wine has been tasted that you start to experience the unpleasant note of mousiness. So some people, though, will claim to you that they can smell it. Okay? It's not a smell. What they are referring to, possibly, is that the wine smells Bretty. They're getting it mistaken with that kind of earthy, manure-y character that one can find through Brettanomyces. Certainly, Brettanomyces is not mutually exclusive from mousiness, so it can be a precursor and, in fact, combined with mousiness, but the smell of Brettanomyces is something you'll experience first. Mousiness is a palate retronasal passage characteristic. Okay. Oh, scary picture. Real life depiction of lactic acid bacteria. Of course, there's an asterisk there because it isn't, but it gives you an idea of some lactic acid bacteria. So, what causes mousiness? So, in terms of chemistry, we have the combinations of 2 or more of the following 3 compounds, and you'll see them up there. And of course, I will do my damn best to try and get this correct for you. So you'll see these here. ETHP, first of all. So this is 2-ethyl tetrahydropyridine. And then we have acetyl tetrahydropyridine. Then we have also acetylpyrroline as your last one there, 2-acetylpyrroline as the last one. So any 2 of the following, those following 3. Now, what causes these compounds to develop in the wine? So these compounds are produced either by lactic acid bacteria, which we have mentioned already on the right-hand side. So that's Enococcus enii, or members of the Brettanomyces, so the Decora family of spoilage yeasts. So you'll often find Brettanomyces bruxellensis as the key indicator. So lactic acid bacteria and Brettanomyces. So you're already thinking in your mind, if you study wine, you're thinking around natural processes of wild yeast, for example, and bacteria for this. So let's go through those risk factors. So what are these risk factors? So this is a little bit more hearsay and more anecdotal. We don't have concrete hard evidence for this, but it's logical to process this information by talking about what we've just mentioned. talking about Brettanomyces and the likes of the lactic acid bacteria. So we think that low levels of free sulfur dioxide, which we'll talk about in the next slide, a high pH, which often then relates to a low acidity. So a high pH, we're talking about often around 4 or even in excess of 4. And the likes of poor hygiene, along with the presence of oxygen, probably are the best conditions in terms of mousiness to develop. So things like overripe grapes, which have low acidity and a high pH, working with no or very little added sulfur. Of course, lots of oxygen. You'll see open top fermenters on the right-hand side. That, of course, really gives you the possibility of greater amounts of oxygen. But that's typically in things like barrels, for example, and really not practicing the art of topping up in standard barrels, which creates more ullage, more gap at the top of the barrel, which will create more oxidative conditions. And then also fermentations which are left to be more natural or wild, so not controlling the fermentations, where the risk of lactic acid bacteria and Brettanomyces being a part of that fermentation is higher. So therefore creating the condition. So imagine barrels not being topped up, open top fermenters, wild fermentations, no added sulfur in a warm location where you've used overripe berries. All of these will be significant risk factors in the overall development of mouse taint and the compounds we talked about on the previous slide. Now, I mentioned a phrase about free sulfur dioxide. And this is important because many people do not discuss the differences between bound and free sulfur dioxide. Okay, so with low intervention winemaking, there is often claims that there's no sulfur dioxide being added as a preservative rather, in the winemaking stages. And often there is a lot of marketing around that because it's claimed to be more of a natural product. But some producers will add some sulfur, but it's important to understand that that sulfur may bind itself molecularly to the wine, and there may be some left as free. Now, this is important because when sulfur becomes bound, like the left-hand side of your chart there, it does not have the ability to act as a preservative. Free sulfur is what protects the wine. In certain conditions, you may find that more sulfur becomes bound, certainly when pH levels are a little bit higher, and you might be utilizing wild ferments, for example. It's quite complex stuff. And really fascinatingly, a lot of regulation in the world is not talking around free sulfur in the wine, which is a little bit harder to actually work out, a little bit harder to maintain, but total sulfur dioxide is what is regulated by law. So festivals like the Raw Wine Festival sets their maximum total sulfur at around 70 milligrams per litre. So there is a rule. If you want to be a part of that festival, you have to be at or below that level of total sulfur. But it might mean that you have zero free sulfur in that wine. It might mean that you have some, depending on if it's become bound or not. And really, this does rely on really what happens in winemaking. And there are lots of concepts around this, really potentially how microbiological unstable the wine is initially, or how probably dirty it is, how much wild yeast and lactic acid bacteria are within the fermentation. So it's complex. It is very complex. So that is really just sort of talking a little bit about that. Now, I'm a winemaker. So we have noticed in our wines that we lose a lot of sulfur to it becoming bound. So actually, through the years, we found that we've added a little bit more each time, and we've noticed that we have more free sulfur now. But initially, in our first vintage, for example, we had hardly any, despite the fact of adding the recommended amounts from all of the kind of textbooks and understanding that we had. So it may be in certain areas that your wines become bound with sulfur dioxide more easily, and you may have to add more for free sulfur. Okay, so we've talked about wine production and mousiness. And of course, we're going to now talk about mousiness with wine that is open. So if you have active lactic acid bacteria and Brettanomyces found within a wine, can this prompt mousiness to occur within that wine? And really, once again, no hard and fast scientific data here, but this is much more about experience of myself and other colleagues in the wine industry. What do you need for this to develop? So it may be that you have a bottle open, you smell it, you taste it, and everything is fine with that wine. But after 30 minutes, after an hour, after 2 hours, it starts to become mousy in its characteristic. What has created this? Well, oxygen contact and possibly warmth. So you are in an environment where this is engaging those two. So the heat is in fact causing this and oxidation to occur possibly. So this could be very disappointing. And often I actually find this not immediately, but I open a bottle, everything tastes fine. It's fairly natural. It has a beautiful amount of freshness to it. But then I come back to it potentially the next day, even with some gas in the bottle that I've sprayed in. I come back to the next day and it has developed a mousy taint. So that happens. Now, you could say, well, Jimmy, you shouldn't have a bottle for over 24 hours. It should be drunk, of course. And yes, that is the case, but it's not always the case. The one that really annoys me is if it develops quite quickly, so much so that whilst you're drinking it and enjoying it, it starts to develop. So that's one thing for me. So some of you might be like, okay, Jimmy, fair enough. It's nice for you to talk about this, but I've had little or no experience with detecting this. In fact, maybe I've never detected this taint before. So why is this? Well, perhaps it's new to you, have not been looking out for it, or you have not found it yet. And maybe you don't drink enough of the wines which are more at risk, such as potentially natural wines, for example. So, okay, you need to be able to look out for this. How do I, or what techniques can I take in order to prepare myself for this? So, yes, trying potentially more natural wines, going to fairs where you'll find more of these wines, or wines that have had low intervention and lower amounts of sulfur added to them. But there is, in fact, a cheaper way of doing this. Try looking out for something like kombucha, for example, or raw kombucha, which can be made at home, but is also made commercially as a product. I have found in these, your sort of fermented tea-based natural product, that it tends to have some mousiness, but also there are ciders, more kind of low intervention ciders, and even craft beers, certainly on the wild side of craft beers, that can have this. But there are some people out there that just cannot actually cannot experience this because it is a taste, of course. Some people might have a form of smell blindness, and that's to one or more of those compounds that can cause mouse taint. And others might have in their palate just a lower level of general pH, so that when the wine reacts with the saliva, it doesn't lead it to high levels of pH, which can create mouse taint. Lucky you if that is the case. But please remember that day to day, and certainly with the experiences that your mouth goes through with other food and drinks, your pH levels will actually change. So some days you might be able to detect it and others maybe not. Maybe one of the most worrying factors is that, yes, there are some people who just cannot detect this, and that may include winemakers. There was this figure going around that 30% of people cannot taste mousiness. And I did a bit of research on this through people who work in the wine trade about where that number came from. Apparently, it was from the guy that crossed Müller-Thurgau in Switzerland, Hermann Müller, and he mentions this. But really, it was not scientifically based. It was not even a sample study. It was just his interpretation. So we don't know if that's true or not. But we certainly know that some people cannot detect this mouse taint. Please let me know if you are somebody who does or doesn't detect this, and maybe after this video you are more appreciative of trying to find this taint and see if you can pick it up. So, is it a taint is a question we can ask. Should winemakers, if they do know it's evident in their wine, should they be selling their wine? Some people really have a differing and quite divisive opinion about this, because it's not a problematic taint in terms of your health. But of course, if you do spend money on a really nice bottle of wine, you open it up and it has this taste which reminds you of a mouse cage or a rat's cage, or maybe you've got problems with rodents in your house and you have that kind of aroma that gets to the back of your palate when you're walking in that area. This, of course, can be a problem, I would find. And certainly if the wine changes with time, when you've only had it open a little bit, I would call this a taint. It's certainly, in my opinion, that it is. There's also something we need to talk about, which I have no scientific backing about. I cannot really start to logically process this, but it is possible, as people have claimed, that if a wine is mousy, uh, it can disappear with time, which is interesting. We mentioned that oxygen, warmth, and time when the wine is open can create more evidence of mouse taint. But if you've opened a bottle, yes, it has mouse taint, and you've got more closed bottles, those closed bottles may actually shake off mouse taint with time. So this is something which is a little bit more tricky to talk about. They say that the wine may actually come round to its senses. The challenge there is if importers and retailers, they will have some stock identified as mouse taint, but then of course it may potentially be okay with time. How do we know this happens? Well, we don't. That's what I mentioned about scientific data behind this. And I can't think of the science behind it, but maybe it shakes it off with very slight oxygen ingress when it's in the bottle, potentially. It could be that very limited controlled oxidation shakes this off, potentially. Or maybe some of the sulfur becomes bound. There's less sulfur free, but that would mean it's less protected. I don't know. It's something quite difficult to talk about. Potentially you have some ideas or thoughts about this, because this is really up for debate. Do wines lose their mousiness with time spent in bottle? Have you experienced this? And please give me the experience that you have found. It'd be great to hear from you about this problem. Personally, then, to conclude, I would say that mouse taint certainly is an issue. I would say around when I experience it really, and I'm very sensitive to it. I really find the taste very unpleasant, and for me, the wine is a goner when I find it. But some people can manage it. Some people don't mind it. Some people find it as a part of the complexity of wine. Um, and maybe you're one of those people who really don't mind. Please do start the discussion. Let me know what you think. For me, I feel that if I detect it, because I'm sensitive to it, I do find it a taint for me personally. Okay, so that's really the end of my video looking at something called Mousiness or Mouse Taint. Once again, please do let me know your thoughts, theories, conclusions, comments, questions. It's good to hear from you about the information in this video. Please make sure that you click like and subscribe. And if you do find yourself in the UK, come and say hello for a glass, or bottle. I've been Jimmy Smith. Ciao for now. Goodbye.